Okay, so this is the fifth lecture in this course on international relations. Today we're going to look at the Middle East, in particular, trying to understand the insecurity within the region. Now, the Middle East is an incredibly complex region. I'm not going to try and explain the entire complexity of the issues that are causing insecurity in the region. What I'm going to try and do is just identify some of the key themes. I'll show you a video on YouTube as well, like a video that's not mine. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a good understanding of some of the things that are driving conflicts, protest, uncertainty in the region, and rivalry between some major countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, before I speak about the Middle East, I think I'll just briefly speak about the diplomatic cable to you guys just one more time. So please just remember that you are going to be writing approximately 600 to 700 words, analyzing the factors influencing a country's foreign policy. You're going to imagine yourself as a French diplomat working in a French embassy in another country, and your job is to give good political analysis back to the Paris government about why your host country, for example, China, Russia, or Saudi Arabia, is behaving the way it is. So if you want to look at China, you could look at its relationship with Japan. You could look at why China feels it's necessary to create the Belt and Road Initiative. You could also look at the militarization of the South China Sea. If you're Russia, you could look at aggression in Eastern Europe or support for the Assad government in Syria. If you're going to look at Saudi Arabia, you can look at its military involvement in Syria or Yemen or its relationship with Qatar. Please work with one other person. Now, I'm not going to speak about this at length, but I think that you should just maybe pause this slide, look through some of the questions I asked in it. These concepts will be interesting to look at in your diplomatic cable. Like maybe you could try and look at some of the questions and think about some of the answers and whether they are relevant for explaining what is happening with the country that you're studying. Okay. So the Middle East. The Middle East, we'll look at identity, geopolitics, and power. First of all, though, the key question I want to ask is, why is there insecurity in the Middle East? So the Middle East is host to a number of failing states. There are a number of wars with international actors supporting different sides and a number of powerful non-state actors like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, who are challenging the governments in these regions. And we also see like the instability caused by the Arab Spring from 2011, which was seen as a hopeful moment for the Middle East in terms of democratic movements, but ultimately led to further conflict in the region. So before we go into that, let's go to the history. Now, there's a really long, complex history to the Middle East, obviously, and I'm going to just try and generalize, and hopefully the generalization will help you understand some of the foundations of the insecurity in the Middle East. So to begin, we need to start with the Ottoman Empire, which ruled the Middle East from the 14th century to kind of the end of the First World War. And if we can see here, the Ottoman Empire obviously started in Turkey. It then expanded quite a bit across the Middle East, into Europe as well, into North Africa. And the intention of the Ottoman Empire was to defend the land of Muslims and ensure security and harmony in its borders. For centuries, this was largely a stable political system in the Arab world. There were only actually 2 revolutions, and both of these failed. And I think one of the reasons that it was largely stable was, although the Sultan, the leader of the Ottoman Empire, had absolute authority over this territory. There was a large degree of self-governance across the Middle East. So there was a lot of autonomous regions that could kind of exercise their own governments within the region. Now, the empire was defeated in World War One in 1918, and then the empire just dissolved. And then Turkey became an independent country, and we had this agreement, which is very, very controversial. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was an agreement between the French and British governments to divide up the Ottoman Empire into different territorial states. Just remember that the Ottoman Empire was a large state that dominated over the Middle East, and the French and the British wanted to divide up this territory into different states. The really big controversial aspect of the Sykes-Picot agreements was the fact that the French and the British did not really give any consideration for the local political realities within these boundaries. There was little consideration for, well, what is the sectarian identity of this population? And the fact is, within these territories, there was many different sectarian divisions, and some of the sectarian groups existed across borders. So if you look at the Kurds, for example, the Kurds exist in Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. So there's little consideration for, well, does this territory actually map with the identities within them? A further problem of the Sykes-Picot was the Arabs felt very betrayed by it. The Arabs actually supported fighting against the Ottoman Empire so that they could create a unitary state. But ultimately, the British and the French divided up these territories themselves. So instead of this kind of unitary Arab states, you got the creation of very artificial, fragile states in the Middle East. Now, I'm going to show you a quick video of ISIS or Daesh, where they come to the border of Iraq and Syria, and they destroy it. And it was a very kind of symbolic point for them because they felt that these territories were Western imposed. They were European imposed state boundaries. So that is the border between Iraq and Syria, and it was seen as dividing the Arab and Muslim population. Now, this agreement, so the agreement was started around 1915 and 1916. It extended over the next 10 years. We had different kind of territorial agreements. Eventually, we settled on these modern borders. And if we can see that this was a source of instability in the Middle East, so a source of instability in the Middle East comes from the creation of these artificial states after World War I. And I'll give you a good example for this.